Hello again, everybody. I'm here to talk to you about the Cold War and to talk about just continuing past and through the stories of the Vietnam War and the Korean War earlier. Last time I posed a question for you, and the question was, how did the United States and the Soviet Union, or USSR, fight the Cold War? And I give you a few examples of how Cold Wars can be fought, and then you've looked at a few of the hot wars of the period. But let's look at some more of the ways that the Cold War was fought. One way that you can fight the Cold War, or you can fight a war without actually shooting bullets, is by spying. And there are lots of spying in this period. We have lots of American spies in the Soviet Union. We have lots of Soviet spies in the United States. Probably the most famous public example of this occurred in May 1960. And so the United States had, in this period, developed a spy plane called a U-2. And the main thing about the U-2 is that it was able to fly much higher than any other plane that was built could fly. And so the United States Department of Defense had assumed that it could fly so high that Russian satellites wouldn't be able to pick it up. And so we were flying these planes over the United States, or over the Soviet Union, rather, and spying on them. And so the Soviets and the Americans were in the middle of some very delicate negotiations. And President Eisenhower was asked by the Soviet government, "You wouldn't be spying us. You're not flying, spy planes over our country." And Eisenhower said, "Oh, no, 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 we would never do that. I don't know what you're talking about. How can you accuse us of such a thing?" And the Soviets, the Soviet premier essentially said, "You're a lying, bleeping, bleeping, bleep, because not only do we have your plane that we shot down, but we actually have your pilot. The pilot actually lived through this and was a prisoner in Russia." And so this was, and it was something that really gave the United States a black eye. Made us look very bad in the world community because we'd been publicly saying, "Oh no, we would never do this," when in fact we were, and we were caught red-handed doing it. Another way that Cold Wars can be fought is by fighting your enemy's allies. So you don't have to fight your enemy, but you can fight their allies. And you already looked at this a little bit, looking at the Korean War, in which America fought against communists in North Korea, as well as Chinese. In the Vietnam War, same sort of thing happened, that Americans were fighting against communists in North Vietnam. Another example of this is what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so just as a bit of background, most of the communist world was in the Far East, near the Soviet Union, and most of the non-communist world was in the West, near the United States and Europe. But there was one exception to this, and that was in Cuba. So the Cuban government, nationalist government, had been overthrown by communists led by Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is the guy on the left. He was a dictator of Cuba and was a communist. And so he was just loved by the Soviet Union, and as the Soviet premier in this picture, Nikita Khrushchev, is certainly showing him a lot of love. So anyway, this was awesome if you were the Soviets, because this was like an anti-American government right in America's backyard. Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. And so the American government under Eisenhower was having none of this. And they didn't want to go to war, but they did want to overthrow the Cuban government. And so what they decided to do is they were going to train, there were a bunch of Cuban refugees, then as now, many people escaping from Cuba to live in the United States. And so the American government, the CIA, began training these Cuban refugees and arming them to go back to Cuba and overthrow the communist government. And you can see in the picture on the left, the place that they were supposed to land is called the Bay of Pigs. And this is where this army of American-trained Cuban rebels was supposed to land, and the United States had promised to provide air cover for them. And unfortunately for these rebels, they were immediately pinned down on the beach by communist forces. And the situation got so bad that the United States declined to send any air support. And so the invasion was horribly mangled, and was another black eye for the United States. You can see the picture on the left. By the time the plan was put into effect, Eisenhower was out of office and John F. Kennedy was president. And you can see, as this cartoon suggests, that the whole thing, this Cuban cigar, blowing up in his face and making him look bad. Though to his credit, he took the blame for it. And this is something American presidents rarely do, is actually take the blame when things go bad. But JFK did, and I think grew a lot from the experience. Another thing that you could do is build walls. The whole Cold War is about figurative wall building, but sometimes it was literal walls. And so, one that was easily maybe the symbol of the Cold War went up in 1961. And so, the background problem to this had to do with the nature of communism and democracy. That if you were highly educated or had elite level job training, but you lived in a communist country, you had no way to get ahead. You had no real choice as far as what job you did. You couldn't make more money than other people. You had to sort of settle for being just equal with everyone. And these people, being highly educated or highly trained, realized that their lives would be absolutely better if they could move to a place where they would be free to pursue the educational or employment opportunities of their choice. They could make more money and live a better life. And so they'd been escaping from countries like the Soviet Union and Poland and Czechoslovakia. And the way that they would do this is they would apply for a passport to travel to East Germany, which was communist. And in East Germany, they would travel to East Berlin, which was controlled by the communists. And then all they had to do was walk across the street to West Berlin, which, as you know from the earlier video, was controlled by the Americans. And from West Berlin, then, they could fly to Europe or Western Europe or to the United States. And so this was happening quite a bit. And it became known as the brain drain, that basically all the smartest and all most educated people were fleeing the communist world, and their training and education were fleeing to the West and benefiting the West and harming the East. And so the East Germans and the Soviet Union decided that they would build a wall. And so literally overnight, soldiers moved in and they threw up an enormous wall around West Berlin to keep people from, the public version was to say, well, we don't want any spies coming in from the West. But the real reason was to keep their own people in, and to make sure that this brain drain was cut off. And so at first it was kind of this rugged, rudimentary wall with barbed wire, but it eventually became a very, kind of highly polished thing, a giant concrete wall on each side. And you can see in the middle there a no man's land, and this would be armed with guards with machine guns and out of towers. And so anybody trying to cross no man's land would get mowed down with a machine gun. And there's actually quite a bit of video of people making this escape and sometimes getting shot down or left to bleed and die in the middle of the space. So the angle we're looking at here, this is taken from West Berlin, and you can see kind of an interesting aspect of this is West Berliners didn't like the wall, but they learned to live with it. And in fact, almost the whole wall was decorated artistically with graffiti and portraits and statements of hope and freedom and things like that. And the East German side, you can see even from the buildings, remained very rugged and plain, and kind of depressing, to be honest. And so the Berlin Wall became a symbol of the Cold War, this figurative divide made literal in the city of Berlin. It also, if you look into this, was a really tough thing for Berliners. Like, imagine if you lived on one side of the wall and worked on the other, like, you're done. You either can't get home or can't get to work, or often like families were divided. Imagine a wall being built, say, along the dividing line between 48348 and 48346, where you simply one morning couldn't cross over that line anymore. And so you had a lot of this. There's a lot of really kind of interesting but cool pictures of, say, a couple on one side of the wall in a tuxedo and wedding dress waving to an apartment window on the other side, sort of, hey, we got married. You can't come see us, and we can never see each other again or visit. But just a very, very hard time for the citizens of Berlin. Another way that the Cold War was fought is through taunting the enemy. And so even if you don't start a war, you can imply that you're going to. And this is probably the most serious moment of the Cold War, is after World War II, the United States had built missile silos in Turkey, which was an ally of ours, and these had been clearly designed to be close enough to launch atomic weaponry at the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union, they had their old friend Cuba, a communist country, and the Soviet Union decided they were going to build some missile silos in Cuba, and they aimed them at the United States. And so in October of 1962, the CIA came to President Kennedy and said, our spy planes have captured this imagery. We know that the Soviets have atomic weaponry. We know that it's in Cuba, and that based on what we know about their rockets, they can easily launch these rockets and attack pretty much any city in the United States. They can knock out, Washington, New York, Detroit, whoever, with no trouble. And so this became a really tense diplomatic standoff as the Americans demanded that the Soviets remove those missiles, and the Soviets demanded that Americans either shut up or take their missiles out of Turkey. In the end, they compromised. President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev compromised and both removed some of their. The Russians removed all of theirs, and the Americans removed most of theirs from Turkey. So we stood down. But for 13 days, we came extremely close to annihilating the world. And because to launch everything that was in these two places would have irrevocably harmed the entire world. And we came very close to doing it. An interesting side note on this is the way that the two countries viewed their leaders. So the leaders compromised and both backed off a little bit. And so peace was assured. In the United States, John F. Kennedy was applauded for this. Americans appreciated his willingness to be flexible. Whereas in the Soviet Union, the Russians and especially the rest of the Soviet government hated it and thought Nikita Khrushchev had showed weakness, and he lost power in the party within a couple of years because he was seen as weak. That if you say you're going to stand up to the Americans, you better stand there and never back down. So just an interesting sidebar on that. A really public version of the Cold War contests is what's known as the space race. In World War II, the Russians and Americans and Germans had all been working on rocketry programs to launch weapons at each other. And so a logical extension of building giant rockets is to build them not to launch weaponry, but to launch into outer space. And so this became a huge race between them. And especially for Americans, as they fell behind, the Russians were clearly leading the space race for a good decade. When we look at just kind of landmark achievements, like the first satellite launched into outer space was the Russians. The first animal launched to space and brought back was a dog by the Russians. The first man in space was a Russian. The first woman in space was a Russian. The first space station was Russian. Very impressive here. Certainly, probably started, or maybe the most important start, I guess, of this was the launching of this satellite. The satellite is called Sputnik, and it was launched by the Russians in early 1957. And there was really nothing to it. It's a metal ball that went beep. But you could, it was put into orbit around the Earth, and Americans could go out at night and see the sun glinting off the thing and see the star moving across the sky. We can do this now anytime we want, but at the time it had never been seen. There had never been a man-made satellite put into outer space. And this terrified Americans because there was no knowing what it was. It was, was it a weapon? Was it to spy? Was it a camera? Was it a radar? Like, Americans had no idea what it was. And the fact that A, the Russians were building things and we didn't know what they were, and B, we could not do the same thing, that was terrifying for Americans. And so it was at this time that really America got on its horse and said, okay, we got to catch up. We're behind and we got to catch up. And, whenever you walk down the street today or walk down a corridor at the mall or something, and you see somebody wearing a NASA shirt, which is very popular right now, like, this is where that all began. So probably the most famous, American win, of course, was the race to put a man on the moon, which was accomplished in 1969. And I always find that just amazing that if you think about just the timeline, the Wright brothers first learned to fly in 1903, and within 66 years, we were able to fly humans to the moon, let them walk around for a while, and bring them back safely. That's amazing technological progress in the 20th century. There's a name you should know here. This is Yuri Gagarin. He is the first human in outer space, and a hero of the Soviet Union. Another thing that you can do in terms of trying to fight the Cold War is to try to steal your enemy's allies. And one thing that really changed about the American government from 1945 till about 1970 or so, the American government's foreign policy looked at everybody in the world was looked at in one of two ways. You're a communist or you're not. And as far as we were concerned, all of the communists were just together. They were all the same. They were all best friends, and we would just ignore them and hate them. And if you were not a communist, no matter how big a jerk you were, as long as you weren't a communist, you're cool with us. And one thing that changed in the early 70s, and it really changed because of President Nixon, who, even though he's kind of a punchline now, was very brilliant in his foreign policy. He was the first one who realized, well, he and like his advisors, but they realized that not all communists were the same. And they recognized that just because you're a communist doesn't mean you want to sit around and just be the puppet of the Soviet Union, that you might be a communist who is willing to befriend non-communists to avoid domination by the Soviet Union. And this is particularly true with China. China was a communist country, and back in the day, Joseph Stalin on the left and Mao Zedong on the right, they had been good friends, and had worked together. But over time, China grew resentful of being dominated by the Soviet Union. China's a big country and a more populous country than the Soviet Union ever was. China wanted to make its own decisions and didn't want to be dominated by the Soviets. And so what Nixon realized, and what his advisors put into gear, is, what if we could divide the communists from each other? Maybe they're only working together because our policies are forcing them to work together. And so in 1972, President Nixon stunned the world by visiting China, a diplomatic mission. He spent a week there. Here you see him in front with his wife, Pat, wearing the red coat. And here they are on the Great Wall of China. And this was so stunning to the world. Richard Nixon had become famous as a young man for his public hatred of communists, and in his job as an attorney trying to hunt down and prosecute communists in the United States. And here he was, this anti-communist legend, visiting communist China to befriend them. But it really worked, because the Soviets got terrified. They already recognized that the Western Bloc was more popular and more powerful than the Eastern Bloc. What if chunks of the Eastern Bloc started also peeling off and befriending the United States? And so this really forced the Soviets to take much less of a hard line toward China, and also much less of a hard line toward the United States. And so dividing and conquering your enemies, friends, was a big part of this. Another really public part of Cold War competition had to do with sports. And sports, of course, we love sports. Just humans seem to love competition of this sort. We have entire websites and sport channels dedicated to sports. And sports was a big way, and a very public way, for the United States and the Soviet Union to fight battles. And so, who won a particular swimming contest or something, or a track meet, was something that those two countries could hang their hat on. So there are a lot of competitions in this period. And they didn't even involve all the United States. If you're a hockey fan, one of the most famous hockey series ever played was called the Summit Series. It's a series of 8 games between the Soviet Union and Canada in 1972, famously won by Canada's Bobby Orr, who was also a star for the Boston Bruins. But really, just an interesting and fierce public competition. Easily the most famous of the competitions would be the Olympic Games. And one bit of background knowledge on this is, well, I guess a couple. One is that the Olympic Games were initiated in ancient Greece. They go way back to ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago. And Greece at the time was a series of city-states. Greece was not politically unified. And so once every 4 years, the city-states of Greece would stop any wars that happened to be going on, and they would send their best athletes to compete in these Olympic Games at Mount Olympia, hence the name Olympics. And so because of this, Pierre de Coubertin, a Frenchman in the late 1800s, revived the Olympic Games, and it's obviously incredibly popular still today. Another thing to know about the Olympics is that traditionally, until about the 1990s, the Olympics was always supposed to be about amateur athletes. Professionals were not allowed to participate. And so the United States always took this seriously and would send essentially college all-star teams. So if we were putting together Team USA for basketball at the Olympics, we would get together like a college all-star game, and that's all-star team, and that's who we would send. What the Russians did to avoid this requirement is anybody who was good at a sport, they were drafted into the army. And so, if you were a really good Russian hockey player, you'd be drafted into the army. You technically, your profession would be a soldier, but your only job as a soldier was to play hockey. And so, to all these Olympic contests, the Soviet Union would be sending 35-year-olds in the prime of life, and the Americans would be sending like 20-year-old kids. And so often the Russians were dominant. And there's a number of famous games that came out of this. Olympic medal counts and things like that were super important. But among the more famous incidents of all of this was in 1972, there was a gold medal game in basketball. The United States had won 7 straight gold medals. But in the 1972 final, the U.S. appeared to have won, and the referees basically overruled the outcome and replayed the last 3 seconds, and the Americans won again. But the referees and like even officials from the stands overruled it, and basically they just kept replaying it until the Russians actually won. And here you can see a few of the American players who were extremely angry, extremely dejected, and are still that way today. It's fascinating. They actually refused to accept their silver medals. They said, "No, we won, and we will accept. If you want to award a dual gold medal, maybe, but we won't accept a silver medal." And those medals are still in a vault in Switzerland. And every couple of years, USA Basketball and the Olympic Committee, they call these guys up from 1972 and say, "Hey, you want to accept these?" And a lot of them, their wives or kids are saying, "Oh, Dad, you should. We'd love to have it." And they say no. In fact, one of them even, I read an interview where he said, "No, not only will I never accept a silver, I actually put it in my will, forbidding my wife, children, or posterity from ever accepting a silver medal in my name." So very, very bitter. Another the most famous games was in 1984. The Russians, just as the Americans had been dominant in basketball, the Russians have been dominant in hockey. I think they won 7 out of 9 Olympic gold medals, largely because, again, they had basically like full-time professionals playing against college all-star teams. But in 1984, at the Lake Placid Winter Olympics, the American college kids who had previously, I think their last time they played Russia, they lost like 10-0. But they managed to beat the Russians in the semifinal of the Olympics and then win gold over Finland. And this became known as the Miracle on Ice. It's the subject of probably my favorite sports movie ever, Miracle. I encourage you to check it out. So, in addition to the games themselves, the Olympics were also often used as a political kind of pressure tool between the Russians and the Americans. For instance, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1980 or 1979, the Americans boycotted the Olympics, which were being hosted in Moscow in 1980, and just said, "No, we're not coming," political protest. And the Russians said, "Fine, well, if you're not coming to ours, we won't come to yours." The Americans hosted the Summer Games in 1984 in Los Angeles, and the Russians didn't show. So it became a very political thing. So just one last thought I'd like to leave you with, and that is it's easy for us today, especially for you because you didn't live through any of this, to sort of look at it and think, man, it's all goofy. What a bunch of silly stories and what a bunch of sidebar silly things for people to worry about. But I encourage you to talk to people who are older than you. Find somebody who's say 45 years old or older, your parents or grandparents or something, and talk to them about some of these things and just how they felt about it then. Because when we don't know how a story will end, it's very, I don't know, it's very hard um, to be confident, and it's very easy to overreact. I feel in some ways this way about the quarantine, like not seeing the end of the quarantine in sight. It's got me not nervous, but very agitated. And the same with the Cold War, because we know today how the Cold War turns out. The communism flops and Soviet Union falls apart, and there's virtually no communist countries left in the world. It's easier for us to say, well, we were all worried about nothing. But at the time, it sure didn't feel like nothing. And I encourage you to talk to some people who are of age to remember these things and see what their memories are and how they felt about it at the time. Thank you for watching.